All right, everybody, so here's a quick video on some help with synthesis. So first things first, let's take a look at what the rubric says about synthesis. In order to get full points, so the full 4 points, and to be in the outstanding category, you gotta do this. All right, so it says the ways in which the evidence work together to create a new understanding is fully explained. All right, so in order to get those full points for synthesis, you have to do this. You have to explain how your evidence works together to create a new understanding. All right, so first and foremost, right, if we're still a little bit confused about what synthesis is, it might be new for us, right? It's essentially this, okay? So before, right, you've had multiple sources that say different things, okay? So you've found your 5 different sources, they all say different things, right? But now you got to think about how are they connected, okay? Synthesis is bringing your different sources together in order to create your argument. Okay, so once you have all these 5 different sources, right, and to synthesize something is to bring different things together into one. Okay, so that's essentially what we're doing with synthesis is we're taking these different sources that you have, we're putting them together to create a new meaning, which is your argument, right? That's the new meaning. So there's a few different steps that I have, easy ways to do synthesis. So let's take a look. Okay, so step number 1 is to evaluate your sources. So what sources do you have? What information does each source give you? All right, how can you group these? Right, you have to take a look and see, maybe have a little summary either in your head or write it down about what each source is, right? Maybe separate the primary sources from the secondary sources. And you got to think about, all right, what information does each one give? Okay, so step number 2 is to infer relationships. So you got to think about how are your sources connected just on their own, right? Maybe 2 of your sources, right, say similar things. Okay, can you group your sources in any way? Right? How can you put them together? You have to start to infer these relationships between these things. To infer means to think of something, right, that's not necessarily there. So you're thinking of these relationships that aren't there, right, but you're going to make them come together in your essay, right? And you also want to think about, do your sources say the same thing or is there conflicting information, right? If there's conflicting information, you might need to reevaluate your sources, right? But if they say the same thing more or less, then you can start to group them together into different sources, relationships, right? So step number 3 is to support your argument. So the idea behind having multiple sources is that the more you have, the stronger your argument. Okay, so you have to ask yourself this question. How can you craft your argument so that your sources work for you and your argument? All right, so you have to think about the ways in which, okay, so now you have your sources, they're put together. Okay, so you have your relationships, right? You have to make them work with each other. Now you got to think about how can you put them in your essay so that they can best support your argument and best support the claim that you're making. Step number 4 is to actually go in and craft the argument. Okay, so when you go in to write, have your sources talk to each other. This is called creating dialogue between the sources. All right, I have examples of what that looks like. Okay, and then as you're having your sources work with each other, right, as you're writing your sources so that you have the information coming from 2 different places and it's working with each other, you're also going to insert your own reasoning. Okay, so essentially, right, something that you could think of is that you're having the authors of these different sources talk with each other and talk with you on why your claim is correct. And that is what you're writing, right? Be explicit about how your sources are related and how they come together to support your claim, and use multiple sources per point, right? So however many points you have in your argument, you want to use multiple sources, right? Don't just use one source per one, and don't just use one source for the entire thing, right? The whole idea behind synthesis is to bring multiple ones together in order for them to be strong enough to support your argument, right? So let's take a look at this example. Okay, so in my example for my project, right, you guys remember that I talked about that I'm doing the potato thing, where I'm looking at Native American foods. I decided on the potato, and I'm looking at its impact on the world. Cool, great. So I have 2 sources here that I'm synthesizing together, right? And this is how I did it. So I have this book called The Amazing Potato by Milton Meltzer. And I have this other one, which is a letter that this woman, Irishman Hannah Curtis, made in 1847. So I even went a step further. I have a primary source and I have a secondary source. And this is how I would bring them together. This is how I'd synthesize them with my own reasoning. So this is what I wrote. In the book, The Amazing Potato by Milton Meltzer, he states that the potato was a staple crop in Incan society, and then I have my citation. The potato continues to be an important factor in society hundreds of years later with the onset of the Irish potato famine. In 1847, Irish woman Hannah Curtis wrote a letter to her brother John Curtis. In this letter, she speaks of the struggles and hardships that plagued Ireland as a result of the potato famine. Then I have a citation. Again, it is clear that potato plays an important part in societies across the world. I would obviously do some more reasoning here, right? But do we see how they're kind of talking to each other, okay? In this first one up here, I pulled a quote that talked about something, right? And in the second one, right, I pulled some information that talked about something similarly as well, right? And then my reasoning is what's bringing these two things together to support my claim. Okay, so I'm now explaining, okay, how both of these sources are pointing to my claim and making me correct, all right? So that is an example, right, of how you're going to have your different sources come together, right, work with each other, okay? This is why it's important to further relationships at first, right, so that you can decide how they're going to work with each other and how they're going to work through reasoning in order to make a strong claim.